Welcome to Who We Are. I'm your host, Maya Kalaria. Decolonizing the power of narrative, Who We Are centers the voices of the global majority, people who have experienced colonial harm and marginalization. Those who may have lost connection to their cultures, lands, ancestral heritage, food, spiritualities, languages, and much more through colonization, and are now reclaiming their connection to their roots. This is a living archive for stories of struggle, hope, and healing from systems of oppression. It focuses not on what we do, but on who we are, a bridge between the legacy of our ancestors and those who come after us. So let us bear sacred witness to the stories that have silently lived inside our bodies. Stories that long to be told and heard. This is who we are. Magalí, thank you so much for joining us on Who We Are, the podcast. It is a pleasure to have you here. And I would love to start by asking you to introduce yourself and to share more about the people and the lands that you originate from.
Thank you, Maya, for having me. It's absolutely lovely to be here. My full name is Elia Magalí Morales Gonzalez, but I usually go by Magalí Morales. My father is Guatemalan and my mother is Mexican, and I was born in Mexico, in the Northeast, in a state called Tamaulipas. I am mestiza on both sides, and mestizo means that I have indigenous and Spanish ancestors, right? That mix that is so common in Latin America. You know, the vast majority of Latin American inhabitants are mestizos of one form or another. So I have Mexican citizenship. I had to forego my Guatemalan citizenship when I turned 18 because of the laws of my country. And then more recently, I have lived in the United States for half of my life. And more recently, I became a citizen of this country as well. And I live in the unceded territory of the Awaswas-speaking nation, the land of the Zayante tribe that lived here in the redwood forest of what is now called California for over 15,000 years without ever degrading the environment. So I just want to salute those guardians of this land. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you for such a comprehensive background, not just of the people that you come from, but also the people who steward the land that you live on now, which is always incredibly important. I mean, 15,000 years is incredible.
It's a long time, yeah, to have a sustainable society. You know, the more we learn about these small tribes that lived in the San Francisco Bay and the larger, what is now known as the San Francisco Bay area, the more impressed I am, because of their ability to take care, to let the environment feed them and to have this reciprocal relationship with the land. But I should also mention that, that I very likely, through my parents, have indigenous roots in other parts, in the Americas. My father's family from Guatemala is very likely has some Mayan heritage and maybe also some Afro-Guatemalan heritage. And on my mother's side, the Chichimecas are the people and the Huastecos are the people who lived in the land where I'm from. And I also, there's a family story about having some Kickapoo heritage. And the Kickapoo indigenous tribe was from around Lake Michigan, so from North America. But they were forced down during the Trail of Tears to Oklahoma and Texas. And then they ended up getting a reservation in Mexico. When Mexico had an indigenous president in the 1860s, they were given land in Mexico. So they actually are a trilingual and binational tribe. And I don't have proof, but I have the stories that indicate that may be part of my heritage as well.
Are those stories anything that you feel comfortable sharing now with us?
Sure. This is how I heard the story. My maternal grandmother's grandmother was a full Kickapoo Indian. And she had a child with my great grandfather, great grandfather, who was a courier for President Juarez. This is President Benito Juarez, is the indigenous president I was talking about from the 1860s. And so my great great grandfather would ride his horse to the border and back to bring the president's mail. And he met a woman from this tribe, and they had a child. And he raised that child, a girl. Her name was Guadalupe. And she gave birth to my grandmother and her sisters. And she was so raised outside the child, but, outside the tribe, forgive me. But what's interesting is that she was a Quaker. And, Quakerism is a very uncommon religion in Mexico. There's very few Mexican Quakers. But digging around, I found out not only that the Kickapoo Reservation was established during the 1860s in Coahuila, Mexico, but also that the Quakers had Christianized the Kickapoo tribe during colonization. So I received that part of the heritage. My great-grandmother, my grandmother, and my mother are all Quakers in Mexico. Mm-hmm.
What is your relationship to the Quakers? Is it quite a complex one?
No, actually, it's very simple. I really respect the Quakers tremendously. They are feminists, they are pacifists, they are activists. I just have never belonged officially to a religion, and I don't, the Quakers, they are Bible-based, they are Christians. I do not feel the call to become a Christian in that sense, so I've never officially become a Quaker, but I have tremendous respect for Quakers. And one of the roles that they've played that is also somewhat connected to my national origins is that the Quakers helped survivors of the Guatemalan and Salvadorian Civil War tremendously during the 1980s. When in these wars that were really instigated by the United States were happening, Quaker activists were helping people get through Mexico and into the United States to apply for political asylum. And so, I am proud of those activist roots. And I appreciate, for example, there are different kinds of Quakers, but some of them do silent meditation, which is one of the things I learned in more the Oriental traditions. But I'm sorry, maybe Oriental is like an oppressive term these days. I don't know. But when I studied yoga and meditation and things like Tai Chi, I learned about silent meditation and kind of like body-based meditation, and Quakers lean into that as well by sharing silent meditation in their Sunday services and their meetings.
Do you know much about how they Christianized the people? Because I'm guessing with such rootedness in pacifism and feminism and activism that it wasn't such a brutal conversion as other Christian colonization was.
You know what? It's a good question, Maya. I don't think I know enough about it. I think that the Quakers were also involved in the abolition of slavery, and, they were on the northern side of the Civil War in the United States. I don't know that history well enough to tell it, but I don't know how much credit to give them there. I hope that they would have been kinder, but, to take indigenous people's culture and language away is still an egregious sin, I think. I'm using the word sin. That word is not usually in my vocabulary, but I think it's still an act of violence. So I am not sure. I would like to learn more about that.
Yeah, same here. We've already dived into just such a interesting topic so soon into our conversation, and we may touch on this again, but I wanted to rewind a little bit to the fact that your father is Guatemalan and your mother is Mexican. And I wanted to ask you about what was passed down from either side, if anything, because sometimes we don't always have a lot passed down. Sometimes we do. But I wondered what really sits in your heart strongly about what was passed down from either side?
What a big question, and so juicy and interesting. Well, I have to admit that because I lived in Mexico, I never lived in Guatemala. We visited Guatemala often when I was a child, and I grew up knowing my uncles and aunt very well, and my cousins. I had about 13 cousins on either side, 13 Guatemalan cousins, 13 Mexican cousins or so. And I felt close to all of them. I love Guatemalan food, and and Guatemala is a fascinating country. It's a very small country. It has a very high percentage of indigenous population, about 40%. It's one of the highest in all of Latin America of people who are still wearing their national costume and are still speaking their traditional language and so on. My father he died last year, so I guess I should talk about him in the past tense. He looked very white, and he came from an area of Guatemala that was known for being very racist, even though it was full of mestizos, like I said, right? I mean, one of the big differences between English colonization and Spanish colonization is that the English committed more genocide and the Spanish committed more rape. The Spanish traveled without women, and the English often traveled with women. So they were more interested in miscegenation laws, in forbidding the mixing of the races. But the Spanish, traveled without women. When the Spanish arrived in a place like Mexico, they discovered that the women were very uninhibited sexually, and it was like a paradise for them, where they didn't have to be ruled by all of their repressive Catholic, sexual mores. So our countries tend to be very mixed, but Guatemala preserves more of its indigenous root. And Guatemala it's a very tiny country, but it has many volcanoes. It has about 40 volcanoes. They say that if you unfold it, it becomes very large because of all of the elevation changes. So it's really a fascinating country. And my father, even though he looked very white, even though he comes from a very racist part of Guatemala, he always had a love of the indigenous cultures. And so we visited the ancient temples, and we visited Guatemala during Holy Week, which is very important to the indigenous Guatemalans. The way that indigenous people in Mexico and Guatemala coped with colonization included using a veneer of Catholicism to cover over their own religious practices. So the kind of Catholicism that you find in my two countries is really a syncretic form of religion. So they might be talking about Jesus, but really they're talking about Quetzalcoatl. Or they might be talking about Guadalupe, the Virgin of Guadalupe, but really they're talking about Tonantzin, the earth goddess, and so on. There are many, many layers. And you can see this both in different ways, both in Mayan Guatemala and in Mexico that has many other indigenous roots. So my parents were very interested in that. They were very, I'm a daughter of the lower middle class in my countries. So we didn't have a lot of money, but we had a lot of access to education. My parents were highly educated people who often got ahead with scholarships and just, having their bare financial needs met, but really learning a lot. And so we did a lot of traveling by car and by bus. We visited sacred sites and, old churches and museums. We spent a lot of time doing that. So I have I had access to that. I have a real love of, even with my limited knowledge of Guatemalan indigenous villages, for example, and old traditions. And I had more access to some of that in Mexico because I spent most of my time there. My father immigrated to Mexico when he went to college, and then he married my mother right after college, and he stayed. He never naturalized himself as Mexican, but he stayed in Mexico the rest of his life, and that's where he died also.
Wow. There's so much there. There is so much there. And I have a lot to kind of unpack with that, but I wanted to ask about languages and how, even though your father came to Mexico for college. And did you learn both languages, or was it really mainly, what was your mother tongue?
Well, we speak Spanish in both countries. I mean, Spanish is the colonizer language in both Guatemala and Mexico.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Now, the Spanish is a little different, right? Some of the colloquialisms in Guatemala come from Mayan, and some of the colloquialisms, many of the colloquialisms in Mexico come from Nahuatl languages, which was the language of the Aztecs, and I mean, Mexico has many indigenous languages still today, more than 80. You know, Mexico is
Wow.
very culturally rich, even though it doesn't have such a high percentage of indigenous population as Guatemala. It still has these incredibly rich roots. So, for example, some of the slang that is used in Guatemala for the word for child, or the word for loofah, you know, the thing that you scrub yourself with when you take a bath, it's a Mayan word. In Mexico, it's a Nahuatl word. So, but I grew up speaking Spanish at home. Both my parents learned English as adults, and it was hard for them to learn English. My father got a scholarship from, I believe, the Ford Foundation to get his PhD in an Ivy League university in the United States before I was born. My parents got pregnant with me when they were in Boston, Massachusetts, in the United States, and my dad was going to graduate school. So they learned English the hard way. You know, he basically learned English right before he started a PhD program in English. And they really valued education. So they actually sent me and my sister to a bilingual American school in Mexico City from the time we were very young. So I like to say that I learned English without pain, because I started learning English when I was 3 or so. And I also heard it in utero because my mother was pregnant with me in the United States.
Wow. And so which language for you is the one that you think and feel and dream in, or is it a mix of the two?
You know, it's a mix. I feel very deeply bilingual in English. I dream in English. I'm writing a novel in English. I love English literature. And this is the thing, you know, if I am a decolonizing, re-indigenizing human being, and I reject colonization. But the one thing I want to give credit for, I think, to the English, is for their language. It excites me that many of us are, there are many Indian writers who are translingual writers like me. They grew up with a different language, and yet they write and publish novels in English or books. And so there's something about the English language. I loved studying Shakespeare, and I loved studying medieval English literature, and I have a degree in English literature, and I loved every minute of it. So that is one thing I have to admit. Biased about. I mean, I love Spanish too. And of course, I read widely in Spanish. I use Spanish every day. I in my work as a social worker and counselor, I serve Latinos in the United States every day. So I use both my languages regularly. Later in life, I learned Italian, German, and French, but those are very rusty now because I don't use them much at all.
And in terms of the languages that were prior to colonization, I know there are hints of that now that have weaved into as colloquialisms in Spanish. But I wonder if you grew up hearing any of the original languages, and if so, through what format did you first hear them?
Very little. I studied a little bit of Nahuatl as an adult, and I really want to learn more. In fact, when I went to college in Mexico City at the UNAM, which is the national university, the oldest university in Latin America, not just in Mexico, I wanted to take Nahuatl classes, but they conflicted with my own schedule in the English Lit department. So I wasn't able to, but I have learned some Nahuatl since. There are many Nahuatl. There's about 1 million Nahuatl speakers who live in the surrounding area of Mexico City. But the way colonization and racism work, they haven't really been honored well enough. People are often, children are often embarrassed to speak their mother tongue, or they are chastised for it. It's taken a very long time to include those indigenous languages in public education. It's happening a little bit now, but I think now there's also a resurgence of pride in it. And so, for example, I belong to 3 Facebook groups that teach Nahuatl.
So good to hear.
And that's where I get to learn more about it, how to conjugate verbs. And, it's a very complex language. It's very beautiful and very complex. I love learning about it. But mostly I started learning about it because I was learning Nahuatl shamanism, which is often called Nahualism.
Right. Oh, gosh, that's just opened a whole other portal for questioning for me. Because how did you come along on that path? And how did you find the teacher that you must have found?
Wow, yeah, that is a big question which I welcome. Okay, so this is what I really want to say. My grandmother is a very big figure in my life. She was a nature mystic. She had a special connection to plants and animals all her life. For example, she kept bees, honeybees, and she never wore protective gear, but they never stung her. Never. There was one time my sister and I were riding in her car. She was taking us to the river to swim in her village. And her car was this old truck that you couldn't roll the windows up or down. They were just kind of stuck halfway. And she was a terrible driver. And so she was driving us to the river, and she took the wrong turn, and then she backed up and she hit a box of bees. Gosh. And the bees, enraged, flew out of the box into the car, and they stung me and my sister all over our bodies. We were wearing bathing suits and nothing else. They stung us everywhere, and not a single bee stung my grandmother.
Oh my gosh.
This is how impressive her power was. She also was a farmer. By the time I was a young child, my grandmother was a farmer. Her first career was as a midwife. She delivered hundreds, maybe thousands of babies in the wilds of Mexico. For a while, she and my grandfather lived in a village that was, a day away by mule from the nearest highway. And she became this country midwife before she had any formal training. So she was an incredible person, a huge influence in my life. And she had this profound mysticism. For her, it was compatible with her Quakerism, but truly she was a nature mystic. And I began having spontaneous psychic experiences when I was a teenager. I had a few when I was a young child. I learned to lucid dream when I was 5 years old because I had recurring nightmares. And I needed to wake myself up out of them. They were so terrifying. And I didn't even dare to tell my parents because I didn't think they would understand. I had a near-death experience when I was 11 years old, where I was convinced that I was dying, that if I just relaxed, my soul would separate from my body. I had all these experiences that I couldn't explain and had no guidance around. But I think I inherited this tendency from my grandmother, who, again, was at least 1/4 Kickapoo Indian, right? So when I turned about 18, no, it was a little later. When I turned 20, I read a book that really changed my life about a Mexican mystic. And she's the one I'm writing a novel about. So this is a whole other conversation, Maya. I don't mean to distract us. I won't go into that tangent today. But it set me on a spiritual quest. I read this book, and it said that this woman talked to the trees and to the mountains. And I was like, oh, can a person really talk to the trees and the mountains? I need to know. And so that was the beginning of my spiritual quest. And it took me through many, many avenues. I became a Kundalini yoga teacher, and I learned about meditation that way. I later became an astrologer because, all of these ancient traditions had an astrology. They all had a way of relating to and interpreting what happens in the sky. And then later I studied shamanism. And I found this Nahuatl teacher, I think because I found his book. in a bookstore in the United States, but he is my age. He is Mexican. He was teaching actively, and he was going to teach a course nearby. And so I signed up for it. And then my husband and I took some classes with him. His name is Sergio Magaña Ocelocoyotl. And he has two teachers, at least, in Mexico who come from an uninterrupted lineage. And one of them is the Nahuatl lineage. And we got to meet him. My husband and I did a pilgrimage to sacred sites in Mexico, which are all very relevant to the novel that I'm writing. And we got to meet Sergio's teachers. And one of them, whose Nahuatl name is Xolotl, he is both a Nahuatl teacher, he teaches the language, and he is a keeper of the calendar. So he does Aztec astrology, and he is a keeper of the Aztec calendar, which has these ancient Toltec roots. So I feel like finally, my whole life, after visiting all these sacred sites and all these pyramids and wondering, what are they for? What did my ancestors build this for? I had some answers by being able to study in this path. And that is what got me, opened the door for me to learn a little bit of Nahuatl, mostly for spiritual purposes. And not just the language of the Nahuatl language, but the Nahuatl cosmology, which is fascinating. My ancestors get such a bad reputation in history for having performed human sacrifices, which they did. That there are some facts there. But there's so much that the Spanish misunderstood about their culture and destroyed systematically. The Spanish burnt so many of our books, of our codices, with no regard to the knowledge that was in them. So, when I decided to study these things, and this is what I mean by re-indigenizing my life and decolonizing my life, I said, well, yes, I am a mestiza from the city. I did not grow up in an indigenous tribe. That's true. But if I don't reclaim this for myself, then the genocide is complete.
Yes.
And I don't want that to happen.
Yes.
I felt I had a choice. And because of my own mystical experiences, because this learning answered the questions that had been burning inside of me for decades, then I had all the more reason to do it. So, for example, one of the practices in Nahualism, in Aztec shamanism, is lucid dreaming. And there is a rich and deep tradition about that I've gotten to practice.
I'm still so glad that you did not allow the genocide to be complete, and that even though there's some fragmentation, which there are for so many of us, you did not let that stop you from reconnecting to your roots and your spiritual heritage as well, because it is part of your spiritual heritage and your birthright. And you disturbed the genocidal patterns, you disrupted it, which so many of us are also in the process of in our own way. And it's just such a powerful phrase that you just said. Yeah, because then the genocide would be complete, and we refuse, and you refused. And that is so beautiful. And I just wanted to comment on how the Spanish viewed those human sacrifices as, I'm going to throw a word out there, but I'm sure somewhat barbaric or somewhat, uncivilized. And I just think, isn't colonization like a human sacrifice times 1,000, like 1,000,000? Like, how much blood was spilled?
Yes.
We were chosen as sacrificial lambs for their gain. And so how dare they make such a judgment,
Exactly. It was the most ridiculous form of projection.
Yeah.
Because yes, they killed us left and right. Colonization. I mean, there was a point in Mexico where, whether by murder, through the Spanish or by smallpox, because we had that smallpox epidemic that also wiped out a huge percentage of the population. 90% of indigenous people had been eliminated. And the remaining ones were so proud. They were like, I'd rather die than be your slave. So they were committing suicide in large numbers. And this is where the story also gets interesting, because it was in 1531 when the Virgin of Guadalupe appeared. And, I'm sure for some there's controversy. When I was growing up in my family with my father is a scientific rationalist, socialist who believes religion is the opiate of the masses. And my mother is a Quaker, right? So I was never Catholic, like 85% of the Mexican population. So I always thought that Guadalupe, the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe, was this Spanish ploy to convert the indigenous people, because here she is mestiza. She is, part white, part brown, and she has been co-opted by the Catholic faith. But I didn't understand her true history. And the history is that truly, and there's lots of documentation about the miraculous nature of this painting that appeared on the tunic of this indigenous priest, that depicts this virgin who looks, by the way, some people are going to be scandalized when I say this, but she looks like a vulva.
Yeah.
In every way. And the Aztecs, who were not sexually prudish, knew this. They immediately saw her and they were like, that's the mother.
Yes.
That's the mother. She looks like the mother. This is where we all come from. But not only that, the story about how she appeared and the dialogue she had with this indigenous priest was, she said, "Am I not still here? I am your mother. And you go tell the priest to build me a church right here on my sacred mountain," on this mountain where the goddess had been worshipped for centuries by the Aztecs. So when we look at Guadalupe's story as an affirmation of life, as the thing that brought all Mexicans of all races, including Afro-Mexicans, together, the imported enslaved people is what I mean when I say Afro-Mexicans, that brought them all together and that returned to them the will to live, then the story looks very different, right? So not to mention that, this was another important part in my healing journey and in my spiritual quest, because I'm very open about this story, as you know, Maya. When I was 18, I was in boarding school in Britain and I became pregnant by rape. And that was a very traumatic experience that is the single biggest experience of my life that marked me forever. And in my journey of healing, I really needed to find something sacred that was feminine. I was kind of rejecting Christianity because of the male dominance, built into it. And really, it was the figure of Guadalupe as, who I later discovered is Tonantzin, Mother Earth, who really gave me that, a mestiza woman like me, a figure of kindness and compassion, where I could find some of that refuge. So that is another part of my journey, to find the divine and the feminine, and also, to understand that, just like the earth has been raped, I have too. And that doesn't, the earth is still glorious. The earth is still beautiful. It was a way to kind of rescue my own self-esteem from the wreckage of my life, to identify myself with Mother Earth as a greater figure.
Thank you for sharing that story. I know that you are so open about these events that happened, and that one in particular, but I just want to honor that you have shared that, and how incredibly difficult that must have been to experience, and just everything that came after it and how it shaped you, because it like you said, it was such a, I'm paraphrasing now, but such a defining moment for you. And also as I've said to you previously to this, on this, I said godforsaken island, but, I speak from the UK, I speak from England, and there's many things I love about this country, but, the fact that it happened while you were here it's heartbreaking as well. And it's heartbreaking because I'm also not completely surprised with the nature of how things operate, and how brown women and black women are treated, and Indigenous women. And so I just want to honor the fact that you've shared that. And I'm sure the listeners will feel the weight of that in a really beneficial way. And thank you for sharing that.
Thank you, Maya. I really appreciate your words. I know you and I spoke about this before, but I think I just want to say why it was so defining. And defining is a very good word. The reason it was so defining is because before that, I was this lower middle class girl who had been somewhat overprotected. And every privilege I've ever had was completely stripped away from me when I found myself pregnant, alone, and poor in a foreign country like Britain, and really without support. So it just drove home the nature of the violence, of the structural violence that is built into all of our systems. It opened my eyes to the way that all of us, and especially here you and I are brown women navigating these kind of white dominated, or places where power tends to be held by white people and by men and so on. Right. So it just opened my eyes to the nature of our society irrevocably. There was no going back from understanding that.
Yeah. You couldn't unknow what you now knew, and you couldn't reverse.
Exactly.
And there's this kind of, it feels like, this innocence, and then there's just this very kind of sharp line of, it's almost like taking the red pill or the blue pill or whatever the pill is that,
Exactly. That was my Matrix moment.
Yeah.
I mean, and I wasn't completely overprotected before that. I mean, my father was pretty abusive. I called him a rageaholic who later became an alcoholic. I mean, he had his own wounds from having been orphaned during the Guatemalan Civil War. Now I understand as an adult looking back. But nevertheless, I had some kind of, I'd been protected in some ways. I had some kinds of innocence. I had some privilege that all of a sudden disappeared. So yes, I couldn't unknow what I knew. And I could also see, I didn't have the words at the time, but I was in this boarding school that was an international school that had young people from 80 different countries in the world, that was purportedly built to foster international understanding and prevent war. But everything that I experienced there was a reenactment of the systems of privilege and violence that rule the world outside. It was no different. We did not dismantle racism there. We did not dismantle sexism there. We didn't even talk about it. I mean, we talked about it a little bit. I was in a school where I had classmates from South Africa, some of whom were white and some were black. I had classmates from Palestine and from Israel. I had classmates from Northern Ireland and from the Republic of Ireland, and obviously from Britain, from all over Britain. But we didn't solve it. We didn't crack it. It was not really up for discussion. These systems of violence that rule everything that happens around us. Yeah. So that was my red pill moment, indeed.
This actually does lead me into the next question, which is, red pill moment aside, when was it that colonization became more prevalent in your consciousness? Was it something... Let's just say, I'll very quickly say on my part, it was something that was never spoken about. And it's something I had to come to my own realization about in 2020 when George Floyd was murdered. And somehow my consciousness was ready to allow in the truth, and it all came flooding in, and it felt like a recognition. It didn't feel like a shock. It almost felt like remembering. It was like, oh, this is the thing that I didn't want to look at. But no one had ever mentioned this thing before. So it was just this inherent knowing. But I was in my 30s. It was about 5 years ago. Was there a defining moment for you, or was it something that was always kind of part of your upbringing? And were your parents quite open about colonization?
My parents were quite open about it, but also I acquired this awareness very early, Maya. I mean, Mexico is deeply stratified by class and race. In Mexico, even though we are mostly mestizos, the whiter you are, the more access you have to money and power. The more like if you go to the more expensive restaurants, people look whiter. If you go to the places where people eat in corners on the street, people look browner, right? The more indigenous you are, the more brown you are, the less privilege you have, the less access to money you have, the less access to education you have. This is all very, very stratified. Mexico is a very violent society in that way. It's all baked in. And when I was growing up, I was aware. I mean, when I was 5 years old, I would be riding in a car and I would see a 5-year-old with no shoes and rotten teeth selling chewing gum on the side of the road amid the traffic, right? With probably an indigenous mother who was breastfeeding another child. And, there were entire families begging or selling candy in street corners, living on the street. This was an unavoidable fact of my world. And I had to be a little shut down to just allow that to happen all around me, right? Like there were little ways that I don't know, I must have found ways to justify that in my mind. But there are things that were closer to home that I would question. For example, my father became orphaned in the 1950s during, when the Civil War started in Guatemala. And one of the women who helped raise him, who had been a servant in his home, I called her my nanny. Her name is Susana. She came to live with us when I was born. So she had, okay, this is complicated, but bear with me. She lived in my grandfather's home after my grandmother died. And she bore my grandfather 3 children, and he never recognized them as his. And she was a brown woman with indigenous roots. She didn't speak Mayan, but she had a lot more kind of Mayan in her language. And she definitely looked very indigenous. She always wore a long braid behind her back. She walked everywhere. She never learned to drive. And she was an amazing walker. She just walked everywhere. She was like a very strong, athletic woman who always dressed in a very demure, like in dresses, in a very kind of more like the indigenous way. But she came to live with us when I was born. She became my nanny and my sister's nanny, and she raised us. She did all the cooking and the cleaning in my house and all the hard work while my mother was out working in a middle-class job. And my nanny, I loved her. She was a grandmother. She was like another mother to me, essentially. I loved her. I still do. She died recently, also, I think maybe 2 years ago, at the ripe old age of 94. She was an incredible person. She was so intelligent. She had no schooling. She had no formal schooling, but she was an incredibly intelligent person. She read the newspaper every day, and she always found these great recipes, and then she would try them in the kitchen. She was incredible. And she would never sit down to eat with us at the table. She made our meals, but she never sat down to eat with us at the same table. And I would ask, when I was 5, I would ask, why don't you sit down with me? Sit down with me. I want to eat with you. But she never did. And so that's where my parents didn't enforce that, by the way. It wasn't my parents' choice. It was her decision, but, it was a very telling decision. She belonged to the family. She came with us on our vacations, but really she was just there to work. She was the one who did the laundry, and she was the one who cooked the meals, and she was the one who did the childcare. And my parents paid her well for it. She had a whole bedroom to herself in the house, and she got paid enough to travel to see her children and grandchildren in Guatemala 3 times a year, and to build a house that her family still lives in today, a large house. But she drew the line. She was like, I'm not sitting down with you at the same table to eat. And that has never disappeared from my awareness. I always knew, like, I guess there's two kinds of people, or like there's things that divide us inevitably. That's the message.
It's still mind-blowing to me, and I know this is probably more common than we think, but the fact that she bore 3 children
Yes.
from your grandfather, and yet still, even with that, I mean, I'm going to call it a relationship, but obviously it must have had was it even a relationship? Or, I mean,
Yeah, was
yeah.
it just rape? I don't know, right? I mean, so to my father's credit, my father is a very imperfect man, but to his credit, he confronted my grandfather about this. He loved my nanny, Susana. He was very grateful to her. I mean, it didn't stop him from doing his abusive thing at the house or anything, but he really cared about her in his way. And he confronted his father about how he never accepted that those were his children. And he called them his brothers and his sister. He fostered a relationship with them. We always visited them when we went to Guatemala. He helped them in ways, whenever they had a medical emergency or something, he would give them money and other forms of support. So he claimed them as part of our family. And therefore, in a way, he claimed my nanny as, as a grandmother figure to me, mother to him, although she was only a teenager when she came to work in their home when my father was a little boy, so their age difference was not so great, But so my father did confront my grandfather, and we have claimed her children and grandchildren as part of our family. But I think some lines of discrimination remain, and not all of my father's siblings did the same in the same way. Yeah.
And like you said, it's just very telling, isn't it? The fact that your grandfather didn't claim them as his own, even though they clearly were, and the fact that she held herself back from the communal aspect of eating together. It is very telling. And just kind of going back a little bit about how you were talking about how you came to the consciousness around these differences within society, the class, the race. You are very, to me, and I think others would agree, you're very informed about your history, your family's history, and the colonial history of the lands that you're from, especially compared to a lot of us. And was that something that you learned later on, like the specifics, or were those also stories that were passed down to you? Like, this is what the Spanish did.
I think the best answer to that, Maya, is that on both sides of my family, there were very wealthy and very poor people. My family spanned the social classes very broadly. For example, I had one uncle in Mexico who became the CEO of a huge company, and he had his own private plane and stuff like that. One of my Guatemalan uncles owned a cable TV company, and he was very wealthy also. But then I also had, cousins. I had I had another uncle in Mexico whose wife had no formal schooling, and my cousins grew up in dire poverty. My grandmother had to help them and feed them sometimes because there wasn't enough food. And on the Guatemalan side, there was also some poverty. I mean, certainly my nanny, Susana, who bore these children. And I'll just add, too, that my father believed that my nanny was in love with my grandfather, that this wasn't just rape. But then again, my grandfather treated her very poorly. So, yeah, there's a ton of inequality in that relationship. Whatever that relationship was, which I'm not fully privy to, was riddled with inequality. But so we had family members who went hungry, or who had misery, or who needed to be helped, who received the help of the more wealthy family members. And then there were some extremely wealthy family members. So I felt close to both sides. Also, I went to this American bilingual school in Mexico City that was very expensive. My parents had to make great sacrifices to pay tuition for us to go there because they were lower middle class. But I grew up going to school with the richest kids in Mexico. Some of the kids in my school were the children of the TV stars, of the president, the director of the petroleum company for all of Mexico. These are the kids I went to school with. Some of them had 2 cars of bodyguards behind them at all times, Maya. If I invited one of those girls to my birthday party, the 2 cars of bodyguards were coming too. So this is the strange reality of extreme wealth that I grew up around in Mexico City, even though I didn't really belong to it myself. But then on my summer vacations, we would go stay with my grandmother in her village where she had a farm. She had a little farm. She had an orange grove and she kept honeybees. She had chickens and pigs and cows. She got up every morning at 5 to milk the cows. And so this is the rhythm of life in the rancho, in the farm. And she lived in a tiny, tiny village where children like had no shoes and they were like playing soccer outside with a tin can and no shoes. And that was normal to me because I was there too. I always had shoes. I knew there was some differences dividing me from these children, but I was out on the street playing with them too sometimes. So I feel very lucky now to have experienced all the sides of it, to have never been hidden away from the roots of Mexico. And because it wasn't just poverty, some of it was beautiful. My grandmother's village was beautiful, Maya. There was a fruit stand where we used to go and they would slice coconuts for us and put lime juice and chili powder and we would like eat the coconuts. My grandmother foraged for cactus and she killed rattlesnakes and ate them. My grandmother.
Amazing.
I know. I mean, this is like, I feel so rich because I have these roots, because I got to experience that. Because I would go, even though at the time I would complain, because of course I was influenced by these rich kids in my school. And so I was like, oh, they're skiing in Vail and they have like yachts and off the coast of Spain. This is what my classmates were like. And I was spending my vacation in the village with like eating coconut by the side of the road with these kids. But I feel so rich now to have had that experience.
Yeah.
To have eaten the cactus and the rattlesnake with my grandmother,
And compared to that, I think about these kids that were on their yachts off the coast of Spain and how, to me, that feels like poverty in comparison to at least spiritual poverty.
Yeah, or cultural poverty.
You received. Cultural poverty, yeah, because you had such a rich connection there and learned so much and must have even it's kind of one of those ways of learning where you don't actually even sometimes know how much you're absorbing.
Yes, I had no idea
until later.
I had
you're
no
like,
idea
wow.
what was happening. But I remember it so fondly now. We have lost access to my grandmother's farm because her state, being so close to the United States and to the Gulf of Mexico, it has a ton of drug trafficking activity. It's very dangerous now. One of the most dangerous cartels is based there. And so we don't have access to that land anymore, but it lives in my imagination always. I can go there right now. It's a beloved place to me. Yeah.
I know we are coming to time, so I just wanted to ask a couple more questions. And the one that I was wanting to ask next is, you have mentioned a couple of ways that you're healing from these systems of oppression. Colonialism is the main one, but obviously there's capitalism and patriarchy. And you've mentioned how like reconnecting to the mother aspect when it comes to spirituality, which I very much resonate with as well, and I'm sure many of our listeners do, is also something that you have done. What other ways have you been healing from systems of oppression in your life?
Let's see. So it's a wonderful question, and I don't know which way to enter. I mean, I think one of the things that saves me a lot of grief these days is that I'm a very frugal person, that I don't need to buy stuff to be happy. I feel like I've reclaimed a kind of inner freedom because of that, Maya. So even though it doesn't look like I'm directly answering your question, I think it's a huge part of my access to happiness. I feel culturally rich. I feel rich in terms of what I get to read. I feel rich in my relationship to the spirit world. I am so rich. So I don't need stuff. I don't need a bunch of stuff. I mean, I have some stuff, I have to drive a car because otherwise I wouldn't be able to transport myself in this system where I live, right? That was built all around cars. I wish I didn't have to drive a car. But but I feel very free inside because I do not see myself as just a consumer and an earner. I'm so much more than that. I cultivate many, many friendships and relationships that exist outside of the rules of capitalism. Essentially, I do a lot of volunteering. I have a lot of chosen family. My family on both sides has endured so much trauma that we are today, I'm sad to say, very divided, Maya. I grew up very close with my cousins, and now there's distance between us. I have cousins who are fundamentalist Christians and who are full of homophobia and transphobia and that kind of hate, and I don't support that. I reject that. I love queer culture. I love gay rights. I will always fight for them. I myself identify as bisexual. My child has gay uncles and lesbian aunties in her life that really enrich her life. Like, this is what I think I've given myself permission to love what I love about my culture and to reject what I don't. And that is another area of freedom where I have found a lot of healing, I think, because I don't owe loyalty to some of these old systems. I mean, even though it's tempting sometimes to idealize Aztec culture, and it's not that easy to do because, again, we could talk about human sacrifices and all those things. But I think about, okay, this is the deal. I think about La Malinche. I don't know if you're familiar with this figure, but when Hernán Cortés, who was the Spanish conquistador, came to Mexico, he was given a woman as a sex slave and as a translator. Malinche, her name was Malintzin, so I will call her Malintzin. Malintzin was a very intelligent woman, but she had been a slave before. She grew up in Mayan territory, so she was bilingual between Nahuatl and Maya, and then there had been a shipwrecked man who was bilingual between Mayan and Spanish. And so at first, Cortés had these two translators, and then he just had Malinche because Malintzin, she learned Spanish very quickly. So she was this brilliant, trilingual young woman who spoke Nahuatl and Mayan and Spanish. And she became Cortés's right-hand woman. They had a sexual relationship. She bore probably one of the first, mestizo children, of our whole country. And the conquest would not have been possible without her. She was the most powerful person in that interaction. And she is often perceived in Mexico as a traitor. But you know what? I don't see her that way because she had been a sex slave in that society. And I have no doubt that she would have loved to put a match to that torch and just blow up that whole world that so oppressed her. So, what am I really saying here? What I'm saying is that I'm going nowhere without my feminism. I'm going nowhere without my anti-racism. I'm going nowhere without my solidarity with the queer community. I think healing happens in many avenues. And so I've worked on healing my physical body, my mind, from toxic ideas, my soul from the spiritual distance that I was initially given from my, from my shamanic birthright, as you rightly called it. But I also claim my community with the beings of nature and with other humans. I will not be divided. And I think that healing cannot just be an individual thing. That's an absurd idea. We have to heal together. And the whole point is that we've been artificially divided. And so I reject that. I am taking all my people with me, and I'm not in any way excluding white people. I mean, I have to say, I am the white conquistador lives inside of me too. Sherman Alexie, the Native American writer from the United States, who has fallen from grace because of sexual abuse accusations. But Sherman Alexie once said, the white man and the indigenous man are still fighting inside of me. And what I say is the Spanish man is still raping the indigenous woman inside of me. This is still happening every day. I have to come to terms with my own roots, even my Spanish roots, which I've never I've never wanted to identify with Spain. I've never been to Spain, even though I had some opportunities. And I don't think Spain would ever give me a passport. Spain is famous for rejecting its Latin American immigrants and conquerees. Conquered peoples. So I want to reject it, but it lives inside of me, Maya. What can I do about it? All I can do, I think, is just create a new relationship with the people around me. And sometimes I've been falsely accused of rejecting white people, but the truth is that I have many, many wonderful white friends who are also committed to ending racism. And that's the best thing, I really welcome any person who wants to dismantle oppression and patriarchy. I welcome into my little corner of this movement.
Yeah. And that's the thing. I agree with you. It's not about us rejecting white people just,
in some kind of blanket way.
In some kind of blanket way. It's that if you are not a co-conspirator against systems of oppression and doing the work, like we're doing the work, doing the work to recognize the part that you play and the privileges that you have, and dismantle them within you, then, those unaddressed forms of oppression will then live on through the relationship. And I found that that's what's happened in a lot of friendships that I did have with white people. And for me, that has been quite a boundaried part of my life. So I hear you with that. I feel like it's fantastic to hear that you have white friends that are doing the anti-racism work, because it's not easy to come across a lot of them, I found, who are doing the level of work that it needs to, for us not to have to explain or be siphoned from in some way, whether consciously or unconsciously.
Yeah, I would even go further, Maya, and say that white people who are not doing this work remain wounded and are unhealed.
Yeah.
The chairman of the Amah Mutsun Tribal Band, who represents these lands on which I live now, is a brilliant person, Valentin Lopez. He says, white people, do your work, heal your perpetrator wound, yes, or else you will never be free. So freedom really means that we all come together in solidarity. It's not meant to divide us at all. Like, the division is the artificial part, but we do have to do this work, and we do have to acknowledge the reality. I mean, I was shocked, Maya, when I lived in Britain, to realize that British people, many of the English people that I met, did not recognize Britain's role in colonization of the world. This was the empire where the sun never went down. It spanned the world. The Brits were ruthless. Even in their piracy, they were ruthless.
Yeah.
They stole so much, and they're still in denial about it. How is that possible? So I have found even more. I mean, hey, look, there are problems. There's white supremacy problems in the United States. Of course there are. I mean, they're very blatant. Everybody can look at them now. But there's some portions of the population with tremendous awareness. There's enormous solidarity among some white people here doing the liberation work collectively. And it is not something that I really found in Britain. And the other point of blindness, of tremendous blindness, I was shocked at this. In 2019, many of us were organizing the World Climate Strike. And many of us were sympathizing with the Extinction Rebellion movement that was born in the UK. But there was this point of crisis when the Extinction Rebellion United States wanted to adopt a fourth, demand or clause about anti-racism, and Britain refused. And when it comes to the climate crisis, because make no mistake, the climate crisis is a direct result of colonization. Like, exactly. Colonization was always heading in this direction.
Yep.
The only wild lands left in the world are stewarded by indigenous people.
Yep.
And this is a clear truth. And so colonization was always taking us in this direction. And if some Brits want to do something about the climate crisis, the first thing they need to do is look in the mirror
Yep.
and take account of what their country has done around the world.
Exactly. And when you were in Britain, it was the 1990s, correct? Is that right?
Yes, the beginning, it was 1990 to 1992.
And it's 2025 now, and I literally just posted something on Instagram today because at the moment we're having race riots, and it is wild to me that even now, people who are like on the wrong side of the race riots, let's say, they obviously don't know and remain in denial about it, even though it's just, you could just Google it. But then there's a lot of people, like well-meaning white people in England, who still don't know our colonial history. And they are kind of confused about why the race riots are happening. And I just think at this point in our journey, it's 5 years on from 2020. It's not like it's completely out of the, like, you have heard of colonization at some point somewhere at this stage. You are willfully ignorant at this point, because how you think that us brown and black people have just somehow appeared on the island willy-nilly with no context is mind-boggling to me. And it's astounding. So 2025, like so many years later, this is still going on. And at this point, I just think it's like some sort of plausible denial. They are not wanting to do that shadow work. They are not wanting to face that. And, because there's no excuse now to not know these things.
I agree. There's a very powerful piece of writing that I wish I had in front of me, Maya. I'll dig it up for you. But this Venezuelan writer, imagine the scene where an indigenous leader came to Europe and said, okay, it is written on this paper that you guys took 1,000 pounds of gold and 1,800,000 pounds of silver from our lands. Let's just say it was not theft. Let's say it was a loan. And we'll give you 200 years grace and only 10% interest, as a loan to develop Europe. Why not? But now you need to pay us back. If we applied the 10% interest and the 200 years grace, etc., what you owe us is worth more than the weight of the earth in gold and silver. And there's no way you could pay, not even in blood. So let's not kid ourselves.
Yeah.
Europe, a handful of European countries sliced up the world like an orange and ate it all up. And now they don't want brown immigrants on their land. Guess what? Now they don't want, this encroachment to happen.
Yeah.
Surprise. Well, you know what? Start by giving it all back. Right now in the British Museum, there are some artifacts that belong to my people.
Yes. Same.
Why are they still there? Can we please get them back?
Exactly.
Only been a few hundred years, but we'll forgive you. Just give them back.
And at this stage, it's embarrassing because everyone knows. It's like there's so much consciousness about what the British Museum are doing. And, there's been protests, there's people going in there all the time, tagging them online. And it's like everyone knows. So now it's just clearly very embarrassing and just so clearly immoral. We all know it because there are other countries giving back, there are, even in, I think in the Netherlands, in Germany, like I've heard these stories of, so it's like England, we're all watching you. But the thing is this is the core of where so much of it happened. And so it's so tightly woven. It's so deeply embedded that I feel like we are almost the last to address it because so much of it was birthed from here, but it is crumbling. It's crumbling all around us and it's inevitable and the momentum is going. So I sit with my popcorn and watch sometimes because what else could you do?
Exactly. It's only a matter of time. Yeah. And on all this time, I think of all those brilliant Indian writers who write in English and write like so beautifully, like they've done more with the English language than could have been done otherwise. Amitav Ghosh is one of my favorite writers, and I think about him, for example. So yes, it's only a matter of time. You can only sustain it for so long. And again, we're not rejecting anybody here. We just all want to heal, So white people, heal your perpetrator wound. Wake up to the fact that sharing is better. There's this there are these stories in the United States about how, when the Civil War ended and when, desegregation happened, all of a sudden, white and black people could exist in the same spaces. And there were all these public swimming pools where they could have, enjoyed their times together. But white people, rather than agree to swim in the same swimming pool with black people, they just filled up those swimming pools and they disappeared. They closed down those parks and they closed down those libraries and so many public spaces that could have been spaces of sharing and community. They would rather go without them than share them with brown and black people. And it just impoverished everyone. So when are people going to realize that this state of affairs is, first of all, violent, and that it impoverishes all of us, that we don't need to live this way at all?
Exactly. And what it takes to keep your heart that closed, to have that level of bitterness within you, what kind of a energetic cancer that is, to like literally hold that much bitterness that you would rather close down those places of joy and recreation and community for people of color because of your own fear of losing this illusionary power that you gave yourself and instilled in the systems. And it's like the level of delusion, but also the level of bitterness.
Yeah, and of wounded,
like
which is a level.
It's wounded.
Yeah, it's a level of woundedness. I mean, this is what there's this Native American concept, the wetiko, like the sickness of colonization, the sickness of turning trees into dollars or pounds.
Yeah.
And the sickness of being separated from Mother Earth as if she was just a thing and not an organism that gave life to all of us, where we all, live. Yeah, it is a sickness. And the people who have it are not happy or fulfilled or healed.
Nope.
And healing, once again, is only possible on the collective level. No amount of individual healing will ever make anybody free.
Agreed.
So here it is. It's for the taking, Maya.
Yes.
Let's see who's brave enough to step up.
Yes. And let's see who's listening to this as well. And hopefully this conversation has inspired, a few of you. And I really hope it has, because it's definitely inspired me. And I know that we could talk for so many hours. There are so many different routes that we could go down. But I will end on this very final question, which is, it can be as short as you want, but it's just, what kind of world would you like to leave behind for your descendants? Meaning not just your children, but all of those who come after us.
And I love to think about the next 7 generations, at least, as Native Americans do over here.
Yes.
Well, I say this with a little bit of sadness, because the chances of me living the world that I want are very small. I am a climate justice activist. I am aware of what is happening. I'm aware that this has been the hottest year on record, and the next one will outdo this one. I know that we are all I like to think that there's 2 movements happening, Maya. The old systems are dying because they are cannibalistic and genocidal and ecocidal. And there's also the new culture, the culture that you and I are fanning alive, is rising, right? All the movements of liberation and the remembering of our kinship with the spirit world and with the natural world. These are very much alive, but they're happening at the same time as the carcass of the old patriarchal capitalism is falling apart. So it's a difficult place to inhabit. It's a very difficult place to inhabit.
Yes.
I teach my child everything I know, and I have made an agreement not to lie to her. So I use age-appropriate language. My child is only 9, so I use age-appropriate language as best I can, but I don't lie. And I even just to have a child, I had to convince myself that there are souls who want to be born on earth now for midwifing this thing that is happening.
Yeah.
So I think I pray that our children are earth-loving warriors of peace. It's the best I can hope for. But I have had some visions shamanically of the future. I've had a vision of a descendant of mine, 7 generations down, who is studying plant medicine in a tiny community of scrappy survivors, And by scrappy, I don't know if you guys use that word in Britain, but like resilient, poor but strong.
Yeah.
Skinny and hungry but powerful.
Yes, resourceful.
Thank you. That's what I see.
Yeah.
So, yeah. People who know plant medicine, people who have access to the simple technologies that will continue to exist even when the electronic thing, falls apart.
Mm-hmm.
That's where it's at. Connected with the beings of nature and guided by the spirit world. That's my answer.
Thank you. Thank you so much for just such a rich and dense and complex, beautifully nuanced conversation. It is something that I believe I could listen to back a few times and just still pick out different threads of it, and I'm sure the listeners will feel the same. And thank you for giving so much of yourself to this conversation and your generosity of heart, because this is what it's about. This is decolonial ways of being, and it is just such a joy to have this conversation with you. I could go on forever, but yeah, just thank you so much for being here, and I'm sure that the time will come that we may have another conversation like this, if you're up for it.
I would love it, Maya. Speaking with you is a joy for me also. You inspire me to no end. I feel incredibly lucky to be here with you today. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.